So when you hear the phrase Freedom Day, what comes to mind? I mean, for a lot of us, maybe it's automatically July 4th, right? Fireworks,
Uh-huh.
cookouts.
That's the immediate connection for many.
But does it maybe stretch beyond that to other moments, other, maybe less widely celebrated days that really mark huge turning points, days that absolutely deserve a spot in our collective memory?
That's such a crucial point because, well, for millions of Americans, the real feeling of freedom, the enforcement of it, arrived on a completely different date. A pivotal moment, yeah, but one that took, frankly, a surprisingly long time to reach everyone.
And that's exactly what we're getting into today, Juneteenth. A day with just immense historical weight, huge cultural significance.
Absolutely.
We've gone through quite a stack of sources for you on this one. Everything from, the actual historical documents like General Order Number 3
Right, that the primary source itself.
to interviews with activists who've worked for decades, plus some really insightful analyses from historians, social scientists, the whole picture.
And our goal here, our mission for you today, is to really unpack that full story. We want to look at Juneteenth's origins, which are maybe more surprising than you think, and the traditions, so vibrant, that grew up around it, and maybe most importantly, why its message, freedom, remembrance, activism, why that resonates so powerfully even today.
So not just what happened, but the why it matters now.
Exactly, why it matters and how it keeps shaping how we think about equality, about justice in America.
Okay, let's dive in. The long road to freedom. So the core event, June 19th, 1865. This is when Union Major General Gordon Granger gets to Galveston, Texas.
Right, with about 2,000 Union troops.
And his big first move is issuing General Order Number 3, basically telling the people of Texas, all enslaved people, they're free now. This is based on Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah, and what's just, well, staggering when you dig into the sources is the timing. This announcement, it comes a full 2.5 years after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation supposedly took effect back on January 1st, 1863.
2.5 years? That's
It's-
like hard to even grasp. So why? Why the huge delay? What did the sources tell us?
It seems like a confluence of things, really. For one, there just weren't many Union troops in Texas for a long time to actually enforce the proclamation. Texas was pretty isolated from the main fighting.
Okay, lack of enforcement power.
Then there's evidence that news was deliberately kept from enslaved people by their enslavers, just outright suppression of information.
Wow.
And some accounts even suggest federal troops might have waited, possibly intentionally, until the last cotton harvest was done.
Seriously.
It's a grim possibility mentioned in some analyses. So the big takeaway here, the really crucial thing our sources highlight, is that freedom wasn't just a switch flipped by a proclamation.
No.
For millions, it was a deeply personal struggle, often violent, definitely drawn out. It wasn't just the law existing. It was about the enforcement of that law, or, the tragic lack of it for so long. That's a distinction that often gets lost.
It really does make you stop and think. Just the sheer weight of that waiting. 2.5 years, knowing maybe freedom was declared somewhere, but not for you, not yet. What about some of those stories? The sources must have personal accounts of how long it actually took.
Oh, they do. And they're heartbreaking. Freedom was definitely not instant for so many. You hear stories like Katie Darling's. She was forced to keep working for her former mistress for 6 more years.
6 years after the war.
6 years after the war, after the Galveston announcement. And others faced terrible violence just for trying to leave, trying to claim that freedom they'd just heard about.
That's awful. And it brings us back to General Order Number 3 itself. You mentioned it had sort of two sides to it. The first part sounds great. An absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves.
Right, that's the liberating declaration. But then you read the second half.
What did that say?
Well, this is where it gets really tricky. It advised the newly freed people to, quote, remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. And it explicitly warned they would not be supported in idleness.
Stay put and work. Doesn't sound quite like absolute equality.
Exactly. Our sources really point this out as problematic language. Some call it downright racist. It wasn't just practical advice. It was, in a way, foreshadowing the incredibly long, difficult fight for actual equal rights that would stretch on for generations. It put conditions on freedom right from the start.
So this absolute equality had strings attached immediately.
You could say that. It showed that just being declared free on June 19th, 1865 was far from the end of the story. It was, in many ways, just the beginning of a new struggle.
So, okay, you have this complex moment in Galveston, freedom announced, but with caveats after this long delay. How does that turn into a celebration? How does Juneteenth as we know it begin?
Well, it's fascinating. Despite all those challenges, those mixed messages, starting almost immediately in 1866, black communities in Galveston and nearby areas began commemorating that day. June 19th became Freedom Day or Jubilee Day.
Just a year later.
Yep, and they quickly started traditions. Big feasts were central from the beginning, often described in early accounts as feeling more like a church picnic, a way to gather, share food, and reflect. It was this collective act of marking their freedom, their survival.
That resilience is amazing, creating joy and community space right away. But you mentioned challenges earlier. Did those early celebrations face pushback?
Oh, absolutely.
And
Especially as
also,
Jim Crow laws took hold later in the 19th century. White resistance often meant black communities were barred from celebrating in public parks or town squares.
so what did they do?
This is where that resilience really shines. They found ways around it. They gathered in rural areas, often near rivers or churches. And in some truly remarkable cases, communities pooled their money together, literally saved up pennies, nickels, dimes,
To do what?
to buy their own land specifically for Juneteenth celebrations. Think about that. Buying land for freedom. Emancipation Park in Houston is a famous example, organized by Reverend Jack Yates. Booker T. Washington Park in Mexia, Texas is another.
They bought their own parks. Wow.
Yeah. So those feasts, they weren't just picnics anymore. They became these powerful statements of self-determination held on land they owned themselves. Defiant joy.
That's incredible. But then you mentioned earlier that the popularity sort of dipped in the early 1900s. What caused that?
Right, it wasn't always a steady upward climb. Several things contributed to a decline in the early 20th century. One factor was how history started being taught in schools.
How so?
Well, formal classroom education began to focus more on Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation date, January 1st, 1863. That kind of overshadowed the community-based, home-taught history centered on June 19th, the day freedom actually arrived for many.
Ah, the official narrative versus the lived experience.
Kind of. Plus you had major economic shifts. The Great Migration saw many black families moving from rural farms to cities, often looking for work.
Right.
And urban employers, they were often less willing to give people a day off for a celebration that wasn't an official holiday. Economic pressures made it harder. And, alongside all this, the push for mainstream American patriotism around July 4th was growing stronger.
So Juneteenth got squeezed a bit. It's fascinating how these historical commemorations ebb and flow. But then things picked up again, right? During the Civil Rights era.
Massively. A huge resurgence happened during the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s. People were fighting for freedom and equality now, and looking back at the history of that struggle gave it more power.
Any specific moments that really boosted it?
Definitely. The Poor People's Campaign, organized by Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, is key here. Its culmination in Washington, D.C. was Solidarity Day on June 19th, 1968.
June 19th, directly linking it.
Exactly. And many people who attended that huge demonstration, they came from all over the country. They took the energy and the idea of celebrating Juneteenth back to their own communities. That sparked new or revived celebrations in places far beyond Texas, like Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Los Angeles. It really started to spread.
And that momentum just kept building, didn't it? Eventually leading to official recognition.
It did. Slowly at first, state by state. Texas was the first, fittingly. Thanks to the tireless work of an African-American state legislator named Al Edwards, Juneteenth became an official state holiday there in 1980.
1980. It took a while even for Texas.
It did. But then other states followed over the years, and then, the big one, just a few years ago, really propelled by the national reckoning on race in 2020.
Right, after George Floyd's murder.
Yes, that push, combined with decades, literally decades, of activism by people like Opal Lee, who was 98 years old when it finally happened.
Opal Lee, the grandmother of Juneteenth. Incredible.
An absolute legend, her walking campaign. Anyway, all that effort culminated on June 17th, 2021. Juneteenth became a federal holiday. A truly massive milestone.
From Galveston in 1865 to a federal holiday, what a journey. And how is it celebrated today? It sounds like it keeps evolving.
It really does. It continues to find new forms, new expressions all across the country.
Yeah.
You still have the core community picnics and barbecues, absolutely, but also big festivals, art shows, educational panels, Miss Juneteenth pageants, concerts, all sorts of things. And even if some local events maybe struggle for funding, without big corporate backers sometimes, that core community spirit, that grassroots energy is still very much alive, keeps adapting.
That makes me want to dig into the traditions themselves. You mentioned feasts, but it sounds like there's a lot more depth to it than just, a party.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
It's multi-layered. Food, as we said, is huge. It's always been central. Those feasts are a way for families, for communities to gather, to break bread, yes, but also to really think about the holiday's meaning, its origins. It's about connection, sustenance, remembrance.
And the red foods. I always see lots of red velvet cake, red drinks, watermelon. What's the story there?
Ah, yes. The tradition of featuring red foods and drinks is really powerful and symbolic. The color red, in this context, signifies several things. It represents resilience, perseverance through the horrors of bondage.
Resilience.
And maybe even more profoundly, it symbolizes the blood that was shed, the bloodshed of Black Africans and Black Americans during capture, during the Middle Passage, during the centuries of enslavement.
Wow, so it's a color of remembrance, of sacrifice, as well as celebration.
Exactly. It holds that duality. So you see watermelon, strawberries, barbecue, often with red sauces, red soda water or hibiscus tea, red velvet cake. It's visually striking and deeply meaningful. Even other traditional good fortune foods get a Juneteenth twist, like collard greens might have red peppers added, or black-eyed peas served as part of a dish called Hoppin' John, often with red rice.
That really does underscore both the pain and the triumph, like you said. The joy of emancipation is obviously huge. So the festivals, parades, fireworks, block parties, the pageants, concerts that all make sense as this outpouring of great joy.
Absolutely. The celebratory aspect is vital.
But you also called it a day of dichotomies, joy and despair. How else does that tension show up in the traditions, beyond the red foods?
Well, alongside the joyous parts, there are specific acts of commemoration that really lean into acknowledging the struggle, the despair that came before freedom.
Like what?
Some communities have traditions like going to the coast, if they're near one, and sending fruit out into the Atlantic Ocean. It's a symbolic gesture honoring the ancestors lost during the Middle Passage.
Oh, wow. That's powerful.
Very. Or you'll often see historical reenactments, someone dressed as General Granger reading General Order Number 3 aloud. It helps people connect viscerally to that specific historical moment. These acts, they serve as really poignant reminders of the struggles and sacrifices that made June 19th possible.
In education seems like a big piece too, right? I read somewhere that early on, the Freedmen's Bureau actually used Juneteenth gatherings.
That's absolutely right. In the very early years, the Freedmen's Bureau agents would often attend Juneteenth gatherings specifically to inform the newly freed people about their rights. What freedom actually meant in terms of voting, contracts, education. It was practical information sharing.
So education was baked in from the start.
Yes, and that continues today. Many Juneteenth events have strong educational components, speakers, workshops, historical displays. It really fosters a deeper awareness of U.S. history, especially the parts that maybe weren't taught in school, the hidden elements. It's a great prompt, really, for you, for the listener, to maybe think about your own family history and how it fits into this larger American story.
It really sounds like Juneteenth is deeply, deeply connected to activism as well. Not just remembrance, not just celebration, but action. You said early festivities were like political rallies. What did that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. From the very beginning, these gatherings weren't just social. They were spaces for political mobilization. Community leaders would speak about the importance of voting, about organizing for political power, about economic self-sufficiency, land ownership, issues critical to navigating the post-emancipation world.
So strategy sessions almost mixed with celebration.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And we saw that direct link again, as we mentioned, with the Poor People's Campaign choosing June 19th for Solidarity Day in '68, connecting historical freedom with the ongoing fight for economic and racial justice.
Right. And more recently, too.
Definitely. In 2020, especially after the murder of George Floyd, Juneteenth celebrations became major focal points for protests, for demanding racial justice, for conversations about systemic inequality. The awareness and knowledge shared at these events often directly fuels activism around all sorts of related issues: race, gender, class, healthcare, the environment. It's a day that energizes people to push for change.
It's celebration, remembrance, education, and a call to action.
Exactly, all woven together.
And one last tradition detail I found fascinating. This early custom of formerly enslaved people literally throwing off their old ragged clothes and putting on new ones they had somehow acquired.
Isn't that powerful?
It really is just such a direct, visible symbol, shedding the rags of bondage.
The tangible act of claiming freedom, leaving the physical remnants of enslavement behind and stepping into a new identity, a new future, a very personal, very joyous declaration.
So bringing this all together, what does Juneteenth mean in this sort of wider picture of American society today? It gets called our country's second Independence Day.
And that framing makes a lot of sense, especially when you think back to Frederick Douglass's incredibly powerful speech in 1852.
The one where he asks,
What to the American slave is your 4th of July? A blistering question highlighting the hypocrisy of celebrating freedom while millions were enslaved. For many African Americans, July 4th didn't represent their liberty.
but Juneteenth did, or at least the beginning of it being realized.
Exactly. It marked the moment freedom actually arrived, was enforced, even in the furthest corners of the Confederacy. And while, yes, there were other emancipation dates celebrated in different places,
Right, like in D.C. or other states.
Juneteenth, tied to that specific enforcement moment in Texas, is the one that really endured and eventually grew into this national commemoration. It represents the end of chattel slavery across the entire nation.
And thinking about that legacy, it forces us to confront the larger, more difficult issue, doesn't it? What some sources call the original sin of slavery and the indelible imprint it left. W.E.B. Du Bois famously predicted the problem of the color line would be the defining issue of the 20th century.
And looking back, he was profoundly right. Now, if we step back and look at the big picture, especially since World War II, there's been undeniable, remarkable progress in American race relations.
Sure. The end of legal segregation, the rise of a black middle class.
Absolutely. That's definitely the good news, as some of our sources frame it. Huge strides have been made.
However, the sources also make it very clear that Du Bois's problem of the color line hasn't vanished. It persists today, particularly, they argue, when you look at the challenges faced by what's sometimes termed the black underclass, often concentrated in societal backwaters. High rates of crime, unemployment, persistent poverty, despair.
And this raises a really tough question explored in the analysis. Is this persistence primarily due to, say, individual choices or behavioral dysfunction?
Which is an argument you sometimes hear.
Right. But the sources we looked at argue strongly against that interpretation. They assert that the constellation of challenges sometimes labeled underclass culture isn't some inherent flaw. Instead, it's seen as a direct product of that long history of oppression, slavery, Jim Crow, ongoing discrimination.
So a legacy issue, not an individual one.
Primarily, yes. It's framed as a deep American tragedy, something that requires understanding, empathy, and systemic solutions, not just judgment or demonization.
So given that reality, this idea some people promote of being colorblind in society, does that really hold up? Is it helpful or even possible?
Well, the sources we engaged with argue pretty forcefully that no, a purely colorblind perspective doesn't match the reality on the ground. They show convincingly that color, or race, is far from irrelevant in how American society functions, even with all the demographic shifts happening.
What kind of examples do they give?
Some really striking ones. Things like the statistical reality that black women marry white men at significantly lower rates compared to, say, Asian or Hispanic women marrying white men.
Yeah.
Or the simple observation that Sunday morning church services remain one of the most segregated hours in America. Very few truly racially mixed congregations.
Social patterns, yeah.
Or linguistic divergence, how the speech patterns of some black teenagers in disadvantaged urban areas can differ significantly from standard English, sometimes creating communication barriers. And then there's the really poignant paradox. You have many childless white couples adopting babies from overseas, from places like China. While at the same time, there are many black children in the U.S. foster care system, in those same ghetto areas waiting for adoption, often parentless. These aren't just anecdotes, they're indicators, the sources argue, that the color line is still very much a real factor shaping social interactions, opportunities, and outcomes.
Those are powerful illustrations. It shows race isn't just history, it's woven into the present in complex ways.
Exactly. And this leads to a really interesting, almost counterintuitive point in some of the analysis.
What's that?
The idea that achieving a society where race is genuinely morally irrelevant, meaning it doesn't unfairly determine your life chances, might actually require us to consciously acknowledge race right now.
How so? Seems contradictory.
Well, think about it. To dismantle existing racial inequities, you first have to see them. You have to be able to identify where racial disparities exist in housing, education, justice system, healthcare. Sometimes that means using race as a category for analysis, for tracking progress, for targeting interventions.
Like affirmative action debates, maybe?
That's one area where this comes up, yes.
Yeah.
Or think about the U.S. Army's documented efforts to increase the number of black officers in its ranks. They had to consciously track race and implement specific programs to address the disparity, aiming for a more representative and ultimately more effective force. The argument is that the goal, the moral irrelevance of race, might paradoxically become more achievable because institutions are sometimes allowed to use race strategically to level the playing field and correct historical imbalances.
That's a really complex thought. You have to see race to get beyond race.
It's definitely something to chew on.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Juneteenth's journey. It's incredible. From that single order read out in Galveston.
Delayed freedom.
Right, delayed freedom, to this deeply meaningful national holiday we have today. It really wraps up so much. Joy, remembrance, education, and this constant ongoing push for real justice and equality.
It truly does. And Juneteenth serves as this powerful reminder, doesn't it? That freedom, especially when it comes after centuries of brutal oppression, it isn't simple. It's complex. It's often conditional. It wasn't just magically granted by a single declaration.
No, it had to be claimed and fought for and built.
Exactly. And it leaves you with a really potent question today. That phrase from General Order Number 3, absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property. What does that truly mean right now in 2024 for everyone in this country?
And maybe even more pointedly, what active role can we play in making sure that the promise announced way back in Galveston over 150 years ago is actually fully realized everywhere in America?
It's definitely a day for celebration, no doubt about that. But it's also, perhaps just as importantly, a day to reflect, to learn, and to recommit to the unfinished work of freedom.